Okay, we should be, yeah, sit anywhere, and then I'm going to make the, okay, are we live? Okay, it says we're streaming. There we go. Okay. Okay. Although I forgot to change the stream title. So right now it still says the end from the end of last semester. Whoops. So how many of you guys use Twitch for like game stuff? Yeah. Okay. So the idea of using Twitch for teaching is criminal or awesome? Yeah. Well, let's see. Hopefully we've got our 3 distance people. Henry, are you there on the stream? Can you give us a mic check and whatnot? Oh, blah. I am the. All right. I'm going to do the security thing, and which means scanning my face twice, and it's a little hard to do with freaking masks. Okay. All right, Andrew, did you get yourself into the Twitch chat? Let's see how, hopefully the volume level is good here. Let me check the inputs. You guys hear me okay? Yes, no? All right, sounds great. Okay. I had to redo the input a little bit. So, all right, well, it's 8:01, so let's get started. So, looks like we're a little short on people this morning, although we've got a couple people who managed to get themselves sent home. So, yeah. Anyway, so welcome to what will be the weirdest semester at Wabash probably ever, not including last semester when we just stopped, right? So I'm Dr. McKinney. You can call me Dr. McKinney, or Captain is probably preferable from my Starfleet days. And let's see, so I'm in math computer science, trained as a mathematician. I do math history research, but I'm also kind of gotten a side interest in computer science. And I took precisely one computing course in my entire life. And so everything I know is basically self-taught, which is kind of how it works in the computing world. You know, that even if we teach you like programming language X in 10 years, it'll be something different anyway. So you'll have to, the real key to computer science is learning how to learn it, because it's all going to change anyway. So, or mostly. Okay, so we've got a few people online, and so those of you guys who are online, if you log on to Discord, I can hear anything you say, or if you type in the Twitch chat, I've got a monitor on that too, so I can see your questions or hear them. And then obviously you guys in the room, it's pretty straightforward there. So you guys can, let's start with Canvas. So if I go into the course page in Canvas, it may look slightly different from your view because I'm obviously the instructor. I'm trying something a little different this semester, which is I'm going to organize things in modules, and I'm trying to COVID-proof everything basically. So like, what happens if you get sick or we shut down for 2 weeks, or who knows what happens. So I'm trying to make it sort of as COVID-proof as possible. So this first module has the sort of usual resources, so the syllabus, links to Twitch, the math department YouTube page, and the Discord server. So Twitch stores recordings for 14 days, but it makes it really easy for me to zoink them over to YouTube, and so that's where they'll live permanently. So basically, after every class, I just have to click a button, and Twitch transfers it over to YouTube, and so that's where they'll live permanently. For 14 days after a recording, you can watch it on Twitch also. It doesn't really matter. But if, at the end of the semester, you want to go back to something from next week, well, it won't be on Twitch. So although I think I can link it to my Amazon Prime account, and that gives me 60 days, and hopefully like bits, and I can like hand out like gear for Fortnite in class or something. I don't know, right? uh, you can get a cool skin or something. All right, so yeah, so what I want to kind of start off the class with is kind of just an overview of CS as a discipline and a history. And so I'm not much of a PowerPoint guy, but this seems sort of apropos for a PowerPoint. Welcome, Jeremy. Shout out to Jeremy in the chat. Be sure to like and subscribe so I can get all those sweet affiliate dollars. Not really. Okay. So we'll start off with just a sort of a brief PowerPoint, and just to kind of give you guys an overview of some of the history of the discipline. And yeah, so, and then we'll talk about some other more detailed things. So if anything, maybe you could argue that computing history, I mean, what is a computer or a calculator? People are lazy, fundamentally, right? And so for all of time, people have wondered, hey, could I build a thing that does all this annoying math for me? That'd be great. And this goes back to the ancient world. So this thing's called the Antikythera Mechanism. It doesn't look like much, but because it was found in a bunch of pieces in a shipwreck in the Aegean Sea off the coast of a little island called, guess what? Antikythera, which is called Antikythera because it's the island before Kythera, which is so it's that's the Anti part of it. So in the early 20th century, some pearl divers found this shipwreck, and they found all kinds of cool stuff in it. Coins, gold, statues, various products clearly of the ancient world. And but they also found this thing in pieces. And essentially what it is a mechanical calculator that uses a bunch of gears to display the positions of the planets and the sun and the moon, and also where you are in an eclipse cycle. And it's pretty dang accurate. I mean, at least as much as we've been able to piece it back together. Now, this is interesting because what was the ancient Greek view of the universe? What was at the middle to the Greeks? The Earth. So this was all developed under a geocentric model, and yet it works, right? Yeah, because, I mean, as you learn in physics, no frame of reference is any more or less privileged than any other. And if you develop your mathematics around a geocentric model. I mean, all that the model is trying to do is predict where should you look in the sky to see a planet. Well, that doesn't mean it's actually there. It just means it appears there, right? So there's a difference between the cosmology and the mathematical model. Anyway, so there's people have done some reproductions of this. There's even a guy on YouTube that built a, it's not really a full replica, obviously, but a sort of working replica out of Legos, which is pretty awesome to go on through all that detail. Yeah, so it's pretty neat, and the dating of it is, we think, sort of like 1st or 2nd century AD or Common Era. It's also interesting because guess what's on the side of it? So there's this big metal plate on the side. It's an instruction manual. So it probably isn't the earliest instruction manual in history, but it is kind of hilarious that it came with a, manual. And of course, us being men, what's the very first thing we do? Throw away the instruction manual, right? So, yeah. There's, of course, just one mild problem. The instruction manual is in ancient Greek, so you have to kind of know that to read it. Imagine if your TV came in with an instruction manual in Greek. Anyway, not that we read it anyway, but okay, so flash forward to the 19th century, or sorry, 18th century, and in France, so this would be sort of early first industrial revolution kind of thing. Weaving obviously was an important trade, and people need clothes and whatnot. But you also want to be able to weave things with patterns on them. So if you just want plain white cloth or whatever, a plain solid color, then a loom is relatively simple to construct. Um, but if you want to do stuff that's a little bit more elaborate, then you either need skilled craftsmen or craftswomen in that case, mostly, or you build a machine to do it. And the Jacquard loom was really interesting because it introduced, in a sense, a program. You could program this thing. So you see all these little punched cards with all these holes on them. That determined what the patterns were that the loom would weave. So you programmed the thing by punching cards. And what does this mean, by the way, about pretty much all the first computer programmers in a sense? Who were they? Well, French, yes, but probably all women or mostly women. Um, so yeah, the punch card thing stuck, um, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Um, so flash forward to the 19th century. Any of you guys kind of like steampunk sort of stuff, or anybody play Frostpunk on the PC? No, yeah, okay. So it is steampunk kind of stuff. Imagine a steampunk version of calculators. So Charles Babbage designed, and he never fully built it for reasons I'll get to in a moment, a thing called the difference engine, which uses a bunch of gears and ratchets and mechanical type stuff, so super steampunk-esque, um, to do calculations. And the idea was, and this was in the sort of early 19th century, um, in order for people to do engineering, mathematics, but especially navigation, they needed tables of numbers. And somebody had to compute those things. Well, uh, back then, computer was a job title, not a machine. So you'd have an army of people that was expensive to have such a quantity of people, and they would basically do number crunching all day. Well, as you can imagine, they're going to screw it up from time to time, and in particular, if they use one number that had an error in it in the computation of another one, well, then that new number is also going to have error in it. Okay, so what he set out to do was to be able to print sort of error-free tables of, well, logarithms of trig functions. This is what he needed, but for navigation, that's what you need. But point being, you know, tables of numbers without errors. And so this difference engine does that using a mathematical technique called the method of finite differences. And if you're curious about the mathematical details, you can ask me later. But anyway, it's got gears and latches and stuff like that. It also has perhaps the first accessory, because this part of it is the printer, right? So you've got the engine that actually does the computation, and then the printer attachment that sort of bolts onto the side. So, I mean, when you guys have bought your computers, right, what's the first thing the website or the person's going to ask you? Oh, do you want a printer? What about antivirus? How about this and that? And before you know it, you've spent twice as much money as you thought you would. It's hard to see, but this little knob that's sticking out there is actually a hand crank, and so this is the central axis, and so they put this thing on. And I took this picture at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, and every afternoon at like 2:00 or whatever, they do a demonstration of this, and one of the curators actually cranks it, and they print out a new line of the table on the printer unit. So it's really cool to see how this thing ended up in California. So there's actually two of them in the world. One's in California, the other's at the Science Museum in London. Which, has anybody ever been to London? No. If it's sort of right across the street from the Victoria and Albert Museum, if you happen to find yourself in London, back when we can go to museums, or, you know, when we can go to museums again, or travel internationally, or, you know, do anything fun, then, you know, go check it out, because it's really, really cool. So they basically got some rich internet tycoon, I forget who it was, to bankroll the construction of this thing. And he did it on the condition that they build two rather than one. The other one was destined for his living room, because internet billionaire, right? But for a long time, and I think it's still in the Computer History Museum, it was on loan there. And they have to grease it up to make sure that the gears don't slip, or, I mean, grind or whatever. They use food grade stuff, and that was because it was destined for his living room, and his wife put her foot down that she wanted it not to be smelly industrial stuff. So it's like food grade oil of some sort that they use to grease it up. So he never actually finished building this thing. And of course, what you're looking at is a reproduction, not the original stuff, although we do have some of the original parts for it. Because during the design and construction of it, he realized, you know what, I can do something way cooler. I can build something that not only can compute numbers, but also make decisions. And that fundamentally is the difference between a calculator and a computer. Calculator, you hit buttons, it spits out a number, right? A computer is capable of evaluating a yes-no decision. Is this number equal to that number? Is it greater or less, or something like that? And so he started designing and building a new thing called the analytical engine that would be capable of doing that. He never finished it either, partly because Parliament, who was funding the construction of this stuff, basically got tired of spending money on something that they weren't getting a product out of. And so they cut him off. They said, forget you. All right, so he never finished that either. And to my knowledge, nobody has built a full reproduction of the analytical engine. They built pieces and stuff like that. Maybe one of these days I'll work on that. Anyway, one of the first true computer programs, so not counting, say, the Jacquard Looms, was written, it's a little hard to read here, but this is a program for the analytical engine that would compute Bernoulli numbers, which are an important thing in mathematics. This was written by Ada Lovelace, who was Babbage's sort of assistant, possibly quasi-lover, that's not really clear. Now, you probably have never heard of Ada Lovelace, but you probably have heard of her father. Do I have any English majors in the bunch? Or English minors? Yeah. So Lord Byron, the poet, Ada Lovelace is one of his daughters. So it's sort of interesting that you've got this, wildly romantic poet putting, giving the world a really quite serious mathematician. So yeah, that's where she comes from. So it doesn't certainly look like what you might consider to be a computer program. It doesn't look very codey, although it is. I mean, it looks like a page out of a math book. But in a sense, this was a program that she wrote for the theoretical, what the analytical engine would look like. And um, yeah, all right. So let's flash forward maybe about a little over 100 years. You guys surely have all seen this thing. So what is this? Yeah, it's a German Enigma, though it was actually a Polish company that developed it originally. It was a commercial product, and then the Germans, being the Germans in that time period, took it over and added stuff to it. So this was an encryption device, and that was really useful for military applications because it was small, it was portable, it was relatively simple to operate. So what you have on there is a keyboard where the person's fingers are, and the order of the letters. You notice his right index finger is on the Z key. So in the German keyboard layout, it's not QWERTY but rather QWERTZ. The French keyboard layout's a little bit different and infuriating. I hate the French keyboard layout, but whatever. Have you ever typed in French? Yeah, okay. Anyway, you get used to it, but it's still mind-numbingly annoying. And then the stuff that's up above the keyboard is a bunch of light, it's a light board. So it looks just like the keyboard. It's laid out exactly the same way. And the way that the Enigma works is using what's called a substitution cipher. So if I had a message that I wanted to send you, like Wabash always fights, okay, I could encrypt the message by changing every letter to some other letter. So maybe I change all the W's to Q's, and I change all the A's to F's, and I change, whatever, just pick something. Well, you could probably figure out what the message was by just kind of messing with it for a few minutes, particularly if you know the language that the message was originally written in, right? So in English, you know that E and T are common letters, and they tend to come in certain patterns. And so, if I gave you a scrambled Wabash always fights, you guys with some scratch paper could figure it out in a few minutes tops, right? So that's not a very good way to encrypt stuff if you want somebody to be able to, like if that message gets intercepted, you don't want somebody who intercepts it to be able to decrypt it. So the Enigma was particularly evil in the sense that what it did was it did a substitution cipher, but the letters that paired with each other changed every time you hit a key on the keyboard. Okay, which made it basically almost impossible to crack by hand. And you can't really see this in this picture, but up above there are rotors, and what you would have to do to decrypt it, and this part was both brilliant for usability, but also part of why the Allies were able to crack it, is if you got a message that was encoded, the way you decoded it was the very beginning of the message told you what the initial rotor settings were and where to look in a code book for the initial settings. Those code books were changed and reissued by the German military periodically. So you'd find the appropriate spot in the code book, you'd set the machine up the same way that it started for the person who wrote the message, and then it worked in reverse. So like, let's say the first letter that the person typed was a W, but it came out as an A on the pegboard, okay? You would have A as the first letter of your scrambled message. If you had the rotor settings all set the same way and you hit the A key, the W would light up. So it was a mirror image, which meant that the same machine could both encrypt and decrypt a message on the other end. It was mirrored. And that mirroring actually was one of the flaws that let it get cracked, mostly by the Allies. So yeah, fascinating machine. There are actually several variants of it. So for example, the Navy, their variant actually had 4 rotors rather than 3, partly because it's a lot harder to reissue code books to a submarine, right? You know, they're not exactly around all the time. A little different for the Army. And then I think the SS had its own version, and so there were lots of variants of these things floating around. Um, yeah, there's not a whole lot of them left. I have actually seen one in person at uh, well, before coronavirus, every year I go to a math conference, and one of the people that always sets up a booth at that is the National Security Agency. And they bring their Enigma for the conference to show it off because, well, if you were the NSA and you had an Enigma, that'd be about the only cool thing you could show people without having to then kill them afterwards. So anyway, but yeah, they let you, you know, hit the pegs and make your message, and then they have people give presentations on the math that sort of underlies how it works. It's really quite interesting. And I mean, we could spend an entire semester just talking about that machine. It's that cool. Okay, so let's move on. Bletchley Park, also in England, was a center for trying to decrypt this thing, because of course the Allies are intercepting encrypted messages and really would like to know what the Germans are up to. So a computational center was sort of set up there. Um, the Poles originally had some success, and after Germany invaded Poland, basically everybody fled to England and sort of took up the work there, and were able to crack a goodly number of messages. And I've got one thing out of order here. This was one of the guys who worked at Bletchley Park. Anybody happen to recognize him? No, or know who was the guy? Anybody seen The Imitation Game? Okay, do you remember who the sort of main character was that Benedict Cumberbatch played? Alan Turing. Okay, so this is Alan Turing, brilliant logician, mathematician, and he was one of the sort of chief people at Bletchley Park. In the aftermath of the war in the 50s, he eventually committed suicide because in the 1950s it was still a criminal offense to be gay in England, and so he basically got caught, if you will, and was offered the option of imprisonment or hormone injections. He took the latter, but then eventually was depressed by it and ate a poisoned apple that had cyanide on it. So a bite out of an apple. Some people think that the Apple computer logo is homage to that. I'm not sure, but if that's coincidence or not. But yeah, he lost his security clearance, and it was a big, whole, horrible thing. But yeah. Now, on this side of the pond, we had this machine called the ENIAC. So the Navy was also interested in computing equipment, uh, primarily to do the kind of computations you would need for shipborne artillery, right? So if you want to fire the cannons on a ship against a land-based target, right, there's quite a bit of calculation you need to do as to what angles and which way do you point it. And of course, your ship's moving, and right, so it's a real annoying problem. And they thought, well, if we can automate this sort of thing, that'd be great. And then just have this thing on the ship, and it would spit out the answer, and you'd aim and fire. Uh, this thing took up a whole room. It was gigantic. I mean, imagine your computer taking up the entirety of this room. Uh, and for those of you who are at home, not with us in person, Hazo 03, if you've been down here, you kind of know roughly the size of the room. In normal times, it would seat about 35 to 40 people. In the Corona era, 23, but whatever. So this thing was gigantic, and it used, one of the reasons it was so big is because it used vacuum tubes. And you guys have probably never heard of such things unless you're like a real audiophile that listens to vinyl, like jazz on vinyl records. Do I have any? No? Okay, you guys are too young, right? Yeah. So they're, it almost looks like a little light bulb, and like incandescent light bulb, if you guys can remember back to what those looked like. Um, And they're big, they take a lot of power, they burn out just like light bulbs do. You have to replace them. They're a nightmare. But back in the day, that's what we had. So the ENIAC was based on this thing, and then you've got all those wires and stuff, and that's how you would have to program it. Um, that was cumbersome, right? So if you wanted to do one kind of computation, you had to basically completely reconfigure all the machine. And if you wanted to do something else, you had to completely reconfigure it again. Well, this lady said, that's stupid. That is totally stupid. Why don't we have one machine, and then you tell the machine what you want it to do, but you don't have to reconfigure any of the parts, right? It's the same machine. So her name was Grace Hopper. Um, and she started out actually as a math professor at, oh, I'm blanking on this college name. It's one of the, not Mount Holyoke, it's not Smith. It's one of the all women's colleges that's up in sort of like Pennsylvania area, um, where she had also gone to school. And when World War II broke out, she's like, well, I don't want to just sit around teaching math. I need to do something for the country. So she actually joined the Navy, and that's how she ended up working on this project. So, I mean, here she is in civilian attire, but she was in the Navy for much of her career. And so she came up with this idea, right, of why don't we just have the one machine that you don't have to reconfigure every time, but you reconfigure it through data rather than physical, pegs or whatever. And then eventually developed one of the first computer programming languages called COBOL. Now, COBOL, you may have actually heard of in the news recently. So when the whole coronavirus thing hit in March, right, March and April, and everything shuts down, a lot of people are out of work, right? So what are people that are going to be out of work going to do? Well, probably file for unemployment, right? Would make sense. Uh, the problem is a lot of these old unemployment systems and things, government uh, uh, computers run on these, stuff from the 60s, 70s, 80s that's all run in COBOL. And the people who know COBOL as a programming language that, did this for a career, they've all long retired, right? And so you had to bring all these people back out of retirement to try and patch up the unemployment system so you could process the just deluge of things that were coming in when the economy just went, to the toilet. Like the system was good enough to keep up with sort of normal unemployment, but not, sort of this massive spike. Um, yeah, so here's another picture of Admiral Hopper. She was one of the longest serving and oldest active duty personnel in military history. I mean, she looks like your grandmother, right? And she was promoted to Commodore, and then in the 80s, they got rid of the rank of Commodore and made it Rear Admiral lower half. So Admiral is the appropriate title for her now. Um, anyway, so I mentioned the vacuum tube, right? They look like a light bulb, and they take up as much power and they generate heat and whatnot. Um, one of the things that's sort of funny about Hopper was they were working on the machine one day, and it was not spitting out the correct stuff. And they're like, what on earth is going on? So she opens up one of the cabinets and finds a bunch of moth like webs and bug crap in there. And so she starts pulling all this garbage out. And there's actually a picture of her notebook where she taped the moth into the notebook. And somebody asked, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm debugging. That's where that term comes from. Literally, she was pulling insects out of a computer. So, and the name stuck, and we've just kept it sort of because, hey, why not, right? So vacuum tubes are big and bulky and annoying, and they got shrunk. So this is a picture of a transistor, which has the same function electrically as a vacuum tube, but it's a heck of a lot smarter. It, for the most part, doesn't burn out, and it doesn't take nearly as much energy, right? So you could take a thing that might have been the size of my fist and shrink it down to something that's barely the size of one of your fingernails, okay? We'll talk more about transistors and how they kind of work next week, but this allowed things to get miniaturized quite a bit, and also take up less power. So then there's sort of the trade-off, right? If you can take what would have been the size of this room and shrink it down to, say, the size of the table, well, what about if you then say, I'll make it the size of the room again. I can fit a whole lot more stuff in, which means you now have a more powerful machine, right? So they expand, they contract, they expand, they contract. That was invented at Bell Labs. Here are three of the scientists that did it. Then later, things got shrunk even more to build what's called an integrated circuit. So here's a picture of a very crude early one. The idea is that, and it's frankly kind of magic how it works, you take a piece of silicon that you've chemically messed with a little bit to oxidize parts and not oxidize others. You put sort of a mask over it, you etch certain parts out with an acid, and then you fill in those holes with a different kind of metal, and you kind of layer this stuff up almost like a fancy cake. And then you can build a circuit that is something that you could only see through a microscope. So this is, of course, how all computer processors nowadays are built, is they're all built as integrated circuits. And so if you find, a chip or something, then what the integrated circuit is actually just that tiny little piece inside. The rest of all this crap is packaging and stuff that would plug into a circuit board. So these are really, really, really tiny. And now you can go from fitting, like if we just take my fingernail model, right, one or two transistors in the size of my fingernail, you can now fit billions in the size of a fingernail. Well, that means that you can have a very, very powerful or fast or able to do lots of things kind of computer. And this is why you guys can carry around iPads and laptops and whatnot that can do all the things they do, but yet are light and thin and portable and work on the battery all day. Now, once processors started to become available in really compact form like this, then you could start building your own computer. So here's a picture of the Apple I, or an Apple I. If you bought this from Apple, it basically came as a box of parts. Here's a bunch of chips, here's a circuit board. You had to put it together yourself, right, with a soldering iron. And they sold it for $666.66, which back in the late 70s, early 80s was actually that was a lot of money. And of course, it being Apple 6666, right, I mean, they were definitely playing a little bit, trying to be funny. Well, that looks pretty ghetto, if you will. But flash forward a little bit further into the 80s, specifically 1984, came out with the Macintosh, right? So that was one of Apple's products, and it sort of revolutionized the PC world, or personal computer world, because it was relatively inexpensive, and it was usable. The way they sort of marketed it was, it's the computer for the rest of us. So if you bought an IBM computer, you'd get an IBM computer and a stack of manuals like this big. Well, who wants to deal with that, right? And actually, interestingly enough, do you guys know the printing press here in Crawfordsville? Back in the day, that's what they printed, were computer manuals. Now, since then, they do contract work. So like all of the Harry Potter books for the US were printed here in Crawfordsville. It meant that they had armed guards at the book printing place because, Harry Potter. Anyway, so so the Macintosh was sort of envisioned as a computer for the rest of us. And Apple really they blew the pants off it in terms of the marketing. Have any of you guys ever seen the 1984 Apple Super Bowl commercial? I'll put a link on Canvas to it on YouTube. It is something else. They really went all in with this marketing ad. They spent millions of dollars on a computer ad, and this is in the '80s, right? And you thought all the ads were just going to be for Budweiser and uh, whatever internet business is big this year. So you shrink things down. Now you can take something like this Macintosh here, right? Would have fit, you know, about like that. This display thing is a TV, so it's not flat like flat screens are nowadays. It took up some space, but it would fit on your desk easily. Uh, and this thing would be like hundreds of thousands of times more powerful than, say, the ENIAC that we looked at in the beginning. And in fact, your cell phones have more processing power. Like, so here's my 10R, right? There's more processing power in this thing than the entire Apollo program, both in space and on the ground, right? That's just the way computing works. And one of the things that you'll see in sort of y'all's first couple assignments, I'm going to have you guys watch some documentaries, that the speed of the computing industry advancing is so fast that if you were to imagine that the car industry or the airplane industry moved so quickly. So imagine this. You buy yourself a brand new 747. You fly it to England. You throw it away because now there's a plane that's infinitely better, right? It's that fast. And of course, you guys know this, right? Because new phones come out every year and everybody loses their marbles to get the newest thing. And, any PC gamers in the bunch? Yeah. And so what are you guys all, I'm all excited about, like, to finally see what this 3000 series stuff from Nvidia is, right? And maybe finally get, 120 hertz refresh in 4K and actually be able to run it and whatnot. That'd be great. But it takes a lot of power, and so the computational power of devices increases dramatically over year, and roughly speaking, um, the 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 computing power or the number of transistors, roughly speaking, they're the same thing, but doubles every about 18 months. That's called Moore's law, right? And so now if you go backwards over 40 years, those of you who have taken calculus, 2 to the x is a very fast growing function, right? Exponential growth, well, we're living this right now because that's how viruses replicate, is also exponential growth. So anyway, but you start packing a bunch of these together and you get supercomputers, okay, which is going back to well, if we can fit one on our desk, then we can put a crap load in a big room, and then they can all work on little pieces of a task, and each one maybe isn't all that fast, but the sum total of all of them is really fast. If you start throwing specialized hardware at it, so if you play video games, right, graphics hardware is very dedicated to specific types of computation. Your CPU is a very generalist kind of device, and they both excel at different kinds of things. Your GPU is really, really good at doing the computations for computer graphics, which is why you can play games and have it look cool and run quickly. Your CPU is designed, like I said, for more generalist kind of things, mathematical computations, running the whole system, moving data from to and fro. So if you can recast a problem that you have to use the hardware that can do video computations, then you can speed things up just gratuitously. So a good example of this would be the algorithms for all of the cryptocurrencies, so like Bitcoin and whatnot. Those algorithms run way faster on, if you write them correctly, for graphics hardware than they do for CPUs. So nobody uses a CPU to mine Bitcoin anymore. They're using GPUs or even what's called an ASIC, application-specific integrated circuit. That's where you literally build a circuit to do nothing but crunch Bitcoin, which is insane, but whatever. I think the whole Bitcoin thing is stupid. Now, you put all of these stuff in, if you can package it in something small enough, then you can get a self-driving car. And hopefully eventually I'll be rolling up to campus in one of these things and just be sitting there like, oh, it's a nice morning, and the car will park and drive me straight to the building. It'll be awesome, but I'm not quite there yet. So, um, all right, so that's a quick overview of sort of some of the highlights of computing history. There's way more to talk about, and sort of the first couple things to get into a lot more detail about what I've talked about, and also some of the elements that I chose to exclude from this sort of overview, just for the sake of time. It's not as if the Americans were the only people trying to do this. There was a German guy who built functional computers during the war, named Konrad Zuse. I've also skipped over a lot of the sort of early commercialization, in the 50s and 60s, and some of the history about IBM. So, for example, IBM actually started as a computer company, if you will, but in the 19th century. And in the late 19th century, we were still using mechanical type calculators to do things. So, like, for example, the 1880 census was the first one that was mechanized, and it went way faster than any previous census where they had to do basically everything by hand. Um, so IBM had a very robust line of products that all used punch cards. So their early computers maintained the use of punch cards because their customers already had the punch card stuff, right? So it kind of makes sense. If it'd be kind of like, let's say that Apple releases a new phone. Well, they might have better business if they release a new phone that's exactly the same physical size as the old phone, so that your case from last year still fits, right? Then you don't have to buy a new case too, right? So it's kind of that idea. The things that I picked for you guys to watch and listen to, the Grace Hopper podcast is maybe 15 or 20 minutes, a little bit more specifically about her. The Machine That Changed the World, parts 1 and 2, each one is about an hour. And these are from a documentary that was made in, I think, the early 90s about computing history. So some of the videography is a little crude because it's early 90s technology, not modern stuff. It's a 5-part series. The other 3 parts are really interesting. The 5th part is really hilarious, though, because it's all like, what's the future going to be? And of course, it's the early 90s. And when I watched, I was just like, oh, children, oh, honey, you guys have no idea what you were talking about. So, anyway, and then I've got your first quiz to make sure that you guys, kind of the stuff sunk in. The quiz is you can retake it as many times as you need, right? So I've set things up like that to the goal is that you get all the points, and that if you make a mistake, oh, it was Eckert and Mockley, not Eckert and Mobley or whatever. Yeah. So now with that, I should say, keep track of your stuff on paper, just scratch paper, what the answers are, because that way you don't have to, rethink about it. One annoying thing about Canvas quizzes is, let's say there's 3 questions and you get the first 2 correct and the third one incorrect, and you resubmit it. Well, what do you have to do? You have to put the first 2 answers back in, which is annoying, but there's no way I can change that. I'm sorry. All right, so on Friday, what we're going to do is sort of talk about, well, what actually makes a modern computer a modern computer? And the way I would do this in the before times, before coronavirus, is I've got over in Goodrich a bunch of broken computers that are about 10 years old, and a bag full of screwdrivers. And we just tear them apart and put them back together. Well, we can't really do that and be socially distanced. So we're going to do the next best thing, which is there's actually a game called PC Building Simulator. So I'm going to show you guys how a computer is built in simulation anyway, on my gadget here, and we'll kind of see how that goes. And then next week we'll start, So we're going to start sort of really big, and then we're going to go down to the single transistor level and see how they work. And okay, what happens when you start to put a couple of them together? And then we'll start to see sort of, okay, how you can build logic, and then, imagine just trillions of those, and now you have a computer. So anyway, all right, the Canvas syllabus is there, so take a peek at that. And I think that's it. So I'll stop the stream here, and you guys that are in the room can get out of here. And I will see you guys on Friday.